Welcome to New Hampshire Primary 2020. I'm Bill Greiner, and I'm joined in studio today by U.S. Senator from Colorado, Michael Bennet, and current presidential candidate. Welcome.
Thank you, Bill. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself, background, and then after that, why you decided to get into this
Well,
race?
I won't go on for too long, and it won't sound as long as this sort of, begins to sound. But in the second grade, I was asked to line up. Our class was asked to line up in order of whose family had been here the longest and whose family had been here the shortest period of time. And I was the answer to both those questions. My dad's family had went all the way back to the Mayflower. He had been a public servant in Washington, D.C., of all places, and he taught me that public service is noble. My mom's side, they were Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust, who came to the country under the worst circumstances anybody could, to rebuild their shattered lives. And from them, I learned a lot about the immigrant experience. My grandparents had the strongest accents that I've ever heard, but they were the greatest patriots that I've ever known, and it was very important for them to find this place. I have had a sort of a checkered career as partly as a result of my background. I was a lawyer at the beginning, and then in the private sector, turning around distressed companies. The last deal I did was taking Regal Cinemas, United Artists, and Edwards Theaters and combining them into the largest motion picture exhibitor in the world at that time, Regal Entertainment Group. And then I went to work for the city and county of Denver, and then I spent 5 years as superintendent of the Denver Public Schools. That was a really formative experience for me before I became a senator, because it's a school district of 95,000 kids. It's got a budget of $1 billion, which is 3 times the size of South Bend, Indiana, for example, just to pick one city. And most of the kids are poor, and most of the kids are living in poverty. And it gives you real perspective on some of the injustices that exist in the country. So from that job, I was appointed to the Senate, and I've been in the Senate for 10 years. I won 2 really tough elections in a swing state, Colorado. And if I had to summarize the town halls over those 10 years, it's really easy for me to do. It's people coming and saying, Michael, we're working as hard as we can work, and we can't afford some combination of housing, healthcare, higher education, or early childhood education. In other words, we can't save, we can't afford a middle-class life, and we think our kids are going to live a more diminished life than the life we lived, and maybe even the life that our parents lived. And just to finish, if I think about the families I used to work for in Denver who aren't coming to my town halls because they're working 2 and 3 jobs, what they would say is we're killing ourselves, and no matter what we do, we can't get our kids out of poverty. And I think those town halls are an anecdotal reflection of sort of where we are as a country, when you've seen for the last 50 years, when the economy grows, the people at the very top benefit, but almost nobody else has benefited. And I think that's kind of a fundamental piece of business that we have to take on.
And I know you're spending a lot of time in New Hampshire as the primary, gets upon us. And I'm sure you're finding that a lot of people that you're running into in town halls and meet and greets have those same issues that you hear about in Denver. We're a swing state too. Depending on the year, people vote one way or another.
Yep.
But the problems that you've identified, we hear a lot. What are you hearing specifically?
It's identical to what I've heard at home. In my state's a third Democratic, a third Republican, and a third Independent. In fact, we just learned that independents now the registrations of independents eclipse everybody else. But no matter where I am, no matter what part of the state, it's just like in New Hampshire. That's what I'm hearing, is that people are working really hard and they just feel like they can't get ahead. And I think that's one of the reasons Donald Trump got elected the last time, was people saw this lack of economic mobility and they perceived that Washington was not doing anything to solve it. And so, when I ask people at home, why'd you vote for Donald Trump? They often say, because we wanted to blow the place up. And I say, congratulations, you achieved your objective, but what are we going to now do for our kids and our grandkids and America's place in the world? And I think those are the questions we should be asking.
I think your take on how Colorado's divided is very similar to New Hampshire. I think independent voters or undeclared voters here make up the largest single voting block, and in our primary here, they get to vote. So
Right.
And because it's really a one-party primary this time, you're going to see a lot of independents play in your race. The advantage you have, I think, over other people in the field is that you do come from a mixed state. You are seen, and you can talk more about this if you
Sure.
like, but you're seen as a moderate in
Yeah.
DC, one that works across the aisle, as opposed to once, sitting on the edge and sticking to a party line, at all costs. So I think that your approach, your background will play well for you here. And you've made it a point that you want to have a flag put down in New Hampshire. Talk about that. Why
Yeah.
why New Hampshire?
Well, just on the first point, I'd say, I know both your senators well, and if you picked up either of them, Maggie or Jean Shaheen, and dropped them in Colorado, they'd know exactly what to do because the politics is very similar, and I feel really at home here. And one of the reasons why I think I have a chance to contest this primary is because independents are voting, and so I've spent more time in New Hampshire than any other candidate for president this time, and I'm still doing, I've committed to doing additional 50 town halls, and I'm in the middle of doing that because I think in the end, for us to win this election, we need to not just galvanize the Democratic base, we've got to win back some of the 9 million people that voted twice for Barack Obama and once for Donald Trump. And frankly, that's how we have to govern the country again. We've got to get to a place where it's not my way or the highway down there all the time. And that's the only way you can make progress in a democracy. And we've sort of lost sight of that in our national policy.
So how do you do that? What's your
I
plan
think
for
the
that?
most important thing to do is to run on an agenda that that can unify people rather than divide people. And that's what I've always done. So like Gene, I don't say one thing in the primary and another thing in the general election. I know that people in Colorado are watching. They want to know what you stand for, and they want you to be consistent throughout the election. And that's the sort of the way that I've conducted this primary election as well. And I think the proposals that I've put together, both on reversing Donald Trump's tax bill and creating a real tax cut for the middle class, a real tax cut that are going to benefit middle-class families and also those who are aspiring to be in the middle class. Investments in this country, the proposals that I've made on education, on immigration, on climate, they're all designed to bring us together rather than push us apart. So climate, you and I were talking about it before we came on the program, you can't solve climate change 2 years at a time. And today in Washington, our politics, if you're lucky, you put something in 2 years at a time, the other side rips it out. Then you put it in, the other side rips it out. We're not going to solve climate change that way. We have to create a durable result, and that's why my climate plan, for example, imagines a world where we're paying farmers and ranchers and foresters to sequester carbon in our soils and our trees in a way of building an unusual coalition of people. I think we need more of that kind of idea in our political system.
And why is that not getting more play, do you think, in the debate stage or in the general discussion?
The climate, or just the fact that we can't get anything done?
The climate piece.
Well, I think it's. I'm hearing a lot about it in my town halls in New Hampshire, and I think people are deeply worried about it. I was going to say, especially the young generation. I think they have a lot of reasons to be furious with us for the debt that we have on the balance sheet, or a lack of investment in them and infrastructure. The one they're really going to kill us for is climate if we don't get something done, because their view is if we don't do it, it may not be available to them to fix. But I hear a lot of seniors in New Hampshire talking about climate because they remember well what the weather was like here when they were young, and people just aren't getting to the temperatures they used to get to, and we have exactly the same thing in Colorado. So it may not have gotten the focus on the debate stage it needs, but it is, other than the economic dislocation we were talking about earlier, it's really the number one issue I hear about.
Talk about healthcare. What's your vision on healthcare, and what would you do?
I was there when we passed the Affordable Care Act, and I never believed that was perfect. And 10 years ago, back then, I led the fight on a public option. We never had a public option as part of the Affordable Care Act. And I, as Bernie Sanders likes to say, he wrote the damn bill on Medicare for all. I wrote the damn bill on public option. Medicare X is what it's called. And I think in the 10 years that have come since we passed the bill, it turns out I was right, because there are millions of people in America who are making too much money to be on Medicaid, but not enough money to have private insurance. And so what this would do is give everybody in America the chance, if they want, to take a public option, pay for it, and to have that instead of private insurance, which is really different than Bernie's plan and Elizabeth's plan, which makes illegal all insurance in the country except cosmetic insurance, and taxes the American people $31 trillion. Under my plan, there's not a single dollar of tax that has to be raised, and in fact, it's net good to our budget deficit. In fact, it doesn't make the budget deficit worse. So what I believe is coverage we can deal with. The real issue is cost on health care, and that's what's killing families in New Hampshire and in Colorado and across the country, because as a country, we're spending more than twice what any other industrialized country in the world is spending on health care, and families are spending twice as much. So I think the biggest things we can do there are require the government to negotiate drug prices on behalf of Medicare and others. Right now, the federal government's barred from doing that. We have to create transparency so everything in healthcare has a price tag and we can actually know what we're buying and what they're selling. That's really important to creating a decent market. And third, we got to incentivize ourselves to be healthier, to eat better, to take care of ourselves, to have access to primary care. And I think if we do that, we discover that we can actually start to wring some of the costs out of our healthcare system and start investing in other things.
At the beginning of our conversation, you talked about education and specifically, your background in education. Frankly, you've got, I think, the best perspective of anybody in the race as to, education, what's working, what's failing. How would you tackle that?
I appreciate that. So first of all, education, like climate, comes up all the time in New Hampshire, Colorado, and the other states that I travel in, and there's a real sense among people that the schools are getting worse, not better. A big part of that has to do with funding, and each state is going to have to figure that out because the federal government is only 9% of what we spend on K-12 education. But here are some things I would do. First of all, we have got to figure out how to pay our teachers like the professionals that we are, that they are. We don't pay them well enough, and we're losing 50% of them from the profession in the first 5 years. That's not just going to be the federal government's job. New Hampshire is going to have to figure that out, but I think the federal government can help with that. And then if you did a poll of people in America and asked them, what does the Democratic Party stand for on education, what you'd hear them say is free college. And as the only superintendent to run for school, I can tell you I'm far more interested in free preschool than I am in free college. And I'm much more interested in what are we going to do about the 70% of kids who graduate from high school and don't go on to college, so they can earn a living wage when they graduate, not just the minimum wage. That's something we can do. I think that's actually low-hanging fruit. We can reinvent the way high school works, community college works. I've made a proposal of how to do that, and I've committed the federal money, if I'm president of the federal government, to spend $50 billion a year for 10 years on this project. If we did it, and you knew that when you graduate from high school you could earn a living wage, it would transform the lives of millions of Americans and transform the American economy for the better.
What roadblocks do you see for that? Is it union issues? Are there charter schools, chip away at that? Where do you, because it makes a lot of sense. And I think most people recognize that teachers and education professionals
Right.
are vastly underpaid for
Yeah.
what they do. It's a common sense, but it just seems like it doesn't.
It hasn't stopped us from trying to get blood from a stone,
Yeah.
and it's gotten caught up in kind of the anti-government rhetoric of the last 15 years or so. And you hear people referring to public schools as, government schools to try to drive a wedge. And there was a time in this country when governors competed to be the education governor. In the 90s, I can remember that happening all the time. I'd like to be the education president. I'd like to drag us into the 21st century so that our school districts are actually giving kids the skills they need to be able to compete in the 21st century, so that we're paying the professionals the way they need in the 21st century. So what I would say is our biggest obstacle to success is change is really, really hard, and it is for understandable reasons, because with change, inevitably there comes a sense of loss, and telling people that we got to do something different from the way we ran our schools 200 years ago is tough, but we have to. We got to figure out how to do it. There's not an institution on the planet that's not figuring out how to reinvent itself to be relevant to the rest of the world, and public education is no different.
And you just,
by the way, it's no one's fault. We inherited it, but now we have to find a way to fix it.
You just rolled out your plan called the Real Deal.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So you asked at the beginning what I was hearing in my town halls, and basically the real deal is a way of responding to that. A dramatic increase in the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, paid family leave, raising the minimum wage, not the same place everywhere in the country, and then creating opportunity through education the way that I just talked about earlier, and then dealing with the generational challenges that some of which we've talked about, some of which we haven't: climate change, investments in our infrastructure, immigration, and restoring integrity to our government. For me, that set of policy answers is what America is looking for. I think it's what New Hampshire is looking for, and I would be comfortable making a pitch on any one of those things in red parts of New Hampshire and in blue parts of New Hampshire. So that's why the plan is different from any other candidates. That's one of the reasons. Another reason is it's paid for. So I've shown the way I'm going to pay for it, so it doesn't add to the deficit. Um, and and I think will have much more of an effect on the middle class in this country and people that want to get into the middle class than any other plan that's been offered by any other Democrat. Some people might say, well, why? What about Bernie and Elizabeth? And my answer to that is Bernie literally, I mean, you can't even really add it up, but if you did add it up, Elizabeth has proposed $41 trillion in new spending. Bernie has proposed $55 trillion in new spending. Neither of them have said remotely how they're going to pay for it, because there is no way to pay for it. And to give you an idea of how much that is, $40 trillion is about what we're going to spend on the federal government in the next 10 years. So basically, Elizabeth is talking about doubling the size of it. Bernie's talking about doing even more. So I look at that and I say, you're never going to be able to do that. So I don't want to spend the next 10 years fighting that losing battle. I want to fight a battle that we can win, that will make a difference for the people that are, having a tough time getting into the middle class, staying in the middle class in New Hampshire and in Colorado and across the country. And I think I've proposed the best plan to do that, and it's called the Real Deal.
And in there, you talk about there's a component there dealing with tax cuts and
Right.
dealing with taxes. And you mentioned at the beginning how when the economy has done well historically, a certain segment has done well, but the majority hasn't done well.
Right.
And I think that there's been a lot of discussion about with the tax laws that was passed and put into law with the current administration, how that's even widened that disparity and has really, not just that, but set people backwards. How do you deal with that?
That's, and that is in fairness to the Trump administration, although on this subject, I'm not sure I want to be fair to them, but they're doing something that's consistent with what Republicans in Washington have been doing since 2001. Since 2001, we have cut taxes by $5 trillion. Almost all the benefit of that has gone to the wealthiest people in America. So you add it all up, and it's actually made our income inequality worse. And since we didn't pay for any of it, we borrowed all that money from the Chinese. I think about this all the time. And Trump did the same thing. He said this was a middle-class tax cut. It wasn't. It was a tax cut for rich people. Borrowed all the money from the Chinese. It's the reason we got $1 trillion deficit at almost full employment. And I think about what if a town, what if a town in New Hampshire, what if the mayor said, or the first selectman, or whoever you decide it is, said, I got a really good idea. I'm going to go borrow more money than this town has ever borrowed in the history of this town. And I'm going to take the proceeds, and I'm not going to invest in infrastructure. I'm not going to invest in education. I'm not going to invest in the sewer system. I'm not going to invest in clean water. I am going to take the money and I'm going to give it to the wealthiest neighborhood in town. Nobody would stand for that. And that basically has been our tax policy since 2001, and that's what Donald Trump has done. So what I would say is, let's stop doing that. The people at the top have done fine in the last 50 years in this economy, but they're working people who can't support a family. And we could make a huge difference with my American Family Act plan and with my plan on the earned income tax credit. And it would lift a lot of people, it would secure a lot of people in the middle class and lift a lot of people out of poverty. In fact, in the first year, it would reduce childhood poverty in America by 40% without adding one federal bureaucrat and for less than 3% of the cost of Bernie's health care plan.
And let's talk about infrastructure for a minute. That was something that was talked about, again, widely
Right.
before the last campaign.
Totally.
You seemed like there was a real large constituency on board from all sides, and it's really gone nowhere. why would you say that it's gone nowhere, and what would you do to bring it? Because I'm sure that you would agree that we've got an infrastructure problem
We have
all
a
over this country.
huge infrastructure problem. You got it here. We have it. We've got it in my state, and what I think it is the best example of how broken Washington is now. And it was broken before Donald Trump got there. There were a bunch of guys there that called themselves the Freedom Caucus that kind of made it impossible for us to even pass budgets. And then Donald Trump showed up, and he didn't even really know how to write an infrastructure bill. So that's part of the problem. It's just sheer competence. But what worries me is we can't even pass a basic infrastructure bill when China is building 3,500 miles of fiber optic cable to connect Latin America with Africa and then connect that back to China so they can export their surveillance state. In 2 years in the last decade, they poured more cement than we did in the entire 20th century. It just gives you an idea of the scale of what we're dealing with. And the politicians in Washington can't even pass a basic infrastructure package. So if I were president, I'd go out and spend the time in the country fighting for a package and bring it back to Washington. I think we need to spend about $1 trillion on infrastructure to begin to dig ourselves out of this hole. And by the way, unlike some of the other stuff we talked about earlier, over the last 10 years, I would have borrowed every dollar that I could have borrowed to pay for infrastructure because at a 0% interest rate, if you don't invest now, it just gets more expensive later. And we lost that opportunity. We still have I think a real opportunity in front of us, but it's the reason why we got to get somebody in Washington who can actually straighten out our politics rather than just dividing people.
So how would you operate day one, and then your first 100 days you become elected president, but you have a split split Congress? You've got a House, say, that stays Democrat,
Yeah.
and a Republican-controlled Senate. How do you navigate that to get things done as opposed to the gridlock?
I think what you got to do is, as I said earlier, you got to take an agenda out to the country. And I would go, when I was going to reverse Donald Trump's tax bill, my first stop would be some red rural county in America. And I'd go there and I'd say, I'm bringing my calculator and I'm going to sit with the farmers and ranchers in that community. And we're going to go through the math because, farmers are among the best mathematicians I've ever known in this country. And I'm going to show them why my proposal is going to be better for them and for their families than what Donald Trump has done. That's not going to be hard to do because Donald Trump lied so much to them about what he had done. And I would use that as an opportunity to bring the Fox News people there too and say, you better come with your calculators because I actually know something about numbers, which not all these candidates do. And let's sit here and have a conversation about it. And we got to get back to a place where we're actually dealing with facts. You can't just do it under the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C. I think we need a president who goes into territory that, is, some people might even call it hostile territory, where they show up and say, this is what I'm trying to do. Or on climate, the same thing. This is what I'm trying to do to make sure that we use the working lands of this country to sequester carbon in our soil. I mean, my healthcare plan, which we talked about earlier, Medicare X, there's a reason why I wrote it so that it starts in rural areas in America where there's one or less insurer. That's because I wanted to say to folks, we understand how difficult your situation is in particular. It rolls out to everybody after 3 years. 10 years ago, some people in these communities would have said to me, we don't want any part of your socialist plan on healthcare. And today what they're saying to me is, thank you for thinking of us.
Talk about the filibuster. That's something that has changed in Washington, making it sometimes more difficult to get things done, and other times now it's making it easy to get things done, but maybe not in a good way. So, where do you come down
one
on
of the
that?
things that I hear sometimes in the town halls is people say, well, why don't you change the filibuster? We should change the filibuster. There's one person in America who can do that, and that's Mitch McConnell. So as long as he's the majority leader, I'm not forgetting rid of the filibuster. And I don't think the problem is really the rules. I think that these rules work for hundreds of years. I think the problem is that it's been a long time since we had an agenda that enough of the country wanted to rally behind that you could get 80 votes, or 90 votes for an infrastructure bill or for a judge. And what's happened with the judges, because we stripped out the filibuster, the quality of the judges has just fallen off the cliff, because instead of having to get 60 votes, a bipartisan vote, now they only have to get 51 votes. And so what they do is people start to audition for these jobs by saying, I'm the most right-wing judge there is. And someday they'll be saying, I'm the most left-wing judge, when what you'd want is people saying, I'm going to be a fair-minded, independent-minded judge. That's something that's happened since I've been in the Senate. And it is not, I have to say that our getting rid of that on judges has done real damage for the American people. When I was in law school, if you were qualified and you were nominated by a president to go on the circuit court or the Supreme Court, you got 90 votes or more. And every time that happened, we reestablished the idea of the independence of the judiciary. So I don't think we're going to fix that probably in my lifetime. I hope that my children are going to be able to, look back into history and say there was a time when we didn't make our courts into the partisan, battleground that I worry that they're being made into today.
One of the other issues that's facing the country now, and it's been exacerbated the last couple of years, is foreign policy and how we're viewed in the world. Obviously, a lot to get done domestic, as we've talked about. How do you go about resolving some of the issues that are now festering across the world? And is it something where you literally go on a world tour?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and interestingly, in every town hall, you'll hear somebody say, what are you going to do to restore America's alliances in the world? Because most people remember we used to have something called American foreign policy, and it didn't matter who the president was, whether they were a Democrat or Republican. They carried out American foreign policy, which is not to say that we didn't have our differences of opinion, but basically a president knew what their job was with respect to the Soviet Union. I think my world tour would start in Europe, and I'd go there and I'd say, we understand, far from thinking that NATO is an albatross, we view it as a critical part of our national security, and we believe you aren't servant states of ours. We are in a partnership, and together we have to push back against Russia, who's seeking to undermine our democracy every single day. With China, actually, this is a place where I thought Trump was right to push back on China. He just did it in a totally unconstructive way that created this trade war that's not going to end well, I don't think, for us. But there's an amazing opportunity for America to lead there, because our interests are basically aligned with the entire rest of the world with respect to China on trade, and I think we can gain a lot by doing that. In the Middle East, comes down again to restoring our alliances and not trying to go to war with every single problem we encounter, but actually trying to solve some of them there, which unfortunately, I have to say from my point of view, Donald Trump has been a very weak foreign policy president. He caved on Russia on the election interference and on Ukraine. He caved to Syria and to Turkey in northern Syria. The Iranians are sort of pushing him around in the Middle East, and none of that is good for our interests. Oh, and I forgot the North Koreans. That's an important one, where for 3 years the president has said, I'm falling in love. I'm in love with Kim. I'm in love with Kim. We're writing love letters back and forth. This is the stuff he said. And unfortunately, it basically gave him 3 years of cover to pursue his nuclear program, which is what he's done.
Oh, great. Well, I appreciate you taking the time out today. We covered a lot of ground. And for those watching at home, you can go on to Senator's website, and we're going to post that up on the screen. And you'll be able to see a copy of your Real Deal plan, which outlines your policy thoughts on taxes, education, climate, healthcare, and a number of other issues, which I think voters will find very informative ahead of the primary. So thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for your time, and I hope your viewers, they go onto my website, they'll find that there are long lists of town halls, and I hope if I'm coming to your area that you'll come out and ask your questions, bring whatever criticism you have. I think that the traditions you have here in New Hampshire of this face-to-face politics is the real way to get this done.
Well, thank you, and good luck.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.